So to begin, how would you define grief?
Grief is the emotional experience that accompanies a significant loss or change in our lives. So I think we tend to associate grief with physical losses, like if someone dies, but certainly 2020 has reminded us that grief can come along with any kind of significant life change. Yeah.
I would define grief as a universal feeling that any person of any age can experience after a loss. It's not necessarily tied to death. It can be loss of job or relationship, cultural value, tradition. So anything that you lose that you're tied to.
So I actually look at grief as a stage of love, because when we lose something that we love, that's how we go into grief. And I always think of it that way, in a positive thing, in that it demonstrates how much we loved something. It could be somebody, it could be a way of being, it could be an experience. I think of nature, and I know that we love nature. And when we lose that, we're experiencing grief, and that we do that because we loved that experience, that person. And so I look at it as a stage of love.
Why is this an important topic to talk about?
Well, I think through all of human history, grief has been a much more common experience, so it's something that people maybe were much more practiced in understanding how to navigate. Since the 20th century and all the medical and industrial evolutions that we've experienced as a species, grief happens a lot less commonly because death happens a lot less commonly. So rather than having that demonstrated to us and practiced all around us as we go through the different stages of our own lives, grief can be much more traumatic and surprising because we don't have as many opportunities to live through that.
I think it's important because I feel like, particularly this year, it can be an invisible force that acts on people's lives, that influences everything from our decision making to our sense of wellness and health. And I think it can be an easy thing to miss that part of what we might be experiencing this year, in addition to, the stress and the uncertainty, is that we've lost things. We aren't able to do our jobs like we have historically. We're expected to not interact with our family and friends like we've been accustomed to in the past. And just the massive, local, state, national, global level changes that we've all been coping with.
It's important to talk about because it is a universal feeling that everyone experiences, but it's also really tricky in the fact that it can turn up in different ways. You can feel it after a loss, but you can also feel anticipatory grief when you're thinking into the future of what could happen. It's kind of this way that our brain tries to prepare us for the worst case event that may or may not happen. And that shows as anxiety often, but it can also be tied to the grief cycle.
I think grief is really important to talk about because we all experience it at some point in our lives. And we experience it at different levels. We have a really intense grief if we lost a loved one. I personally lost my baby girl, and that was so intense because of the closeness to me for that situation. But we also experience grief in subtle ways. I think of what's going on right now with COVID, and people might not realize they're experiencing grief. We're losing things that we're used to, that are normal in our lives. We've lost a normal part of our lifestyle, and that's grief too. So we're all experiencing grief in our lives at different times, at different depths, in different ways, and we also all manage grief differently. So what I love, if we're all talking about it and acknowledging it, we can learn and we can connect over it in a way that helps us through it. When you're able to talk about it for me personally, I shared my experience in losing my daughter, and it actually helped me through the whole experience because I didn't feel alone. While people couldn't necessarily understand exactly what I was going through, they were able to empathize, and they also reached out to me and said how much they appreciated it because it was able to have them connect with me during my time of difficulty. And we all, when you want to show care, how do you do that? Yeah, so I think it's really important to talk about it. And not everyone has to talk about it when they're going through it. We're not forcing anyone to do that, but there's just opportunity if we're all acknowledging that, hey, this is something that connects us all and brings us our humanity, really.
Have you found grief to be a taboo topic to discuss in social settings?
Absolutely. I think for most people, grief can be a very challenging topic to discuss. Many people, I think, these days are brought up with an expectation that you should be able to function, right? And grief is a painful experience that causes us to need to stop functioning sometimes for a while, to get support, to slow down, to reconsider many things about our lives, or to just ask for help. And if our society or our school or our family expects us to be functioning all the time and doing the things we're supposed to do, whether that's work or attending classes, it can be very taboo or very difficult to say, I'm not ready to do that right now.
I think grief can be difficult to talk about in social settings. A lot of times people worry about what to say, or am I gonna bring something up that's gonna be hard on someone? And I think what we all have to do is remember, if you're coming from a place of care, they're gonna feel that. And that's what's gonna matter. And especially if someone's in grief, they're gonna not share if they don't wanna share. So I think, it's been taboo, if you want to call it taboo. But I see a difference now than I did in my parents' and grandparents' generation, where you hide things away, and I feel like I see a lot more people willing to talk about things and able to reach out, and yeah, I think it's a good thing.
There's this idea, because grief does run in a cycle, that once you've gone through that cycle, that you're done grieving. And that's not true at all. So it's really important for people who are grieving, or the people that are supporting them through that, to know that if you revisit one of the stages, it's not a regression or a relapse, that it's all part of the process of grief.
Myth or fact, suicide rates increase over the holidays?
As a suicide prevention specialist, I actually thought that it was a fact, and I have discovered that it is a myth. The CDC has demonstrated that our rates stay the same throughout the year. Primarily, spring and fall are actually higher. But it doesn't mean that it's not more difficult and that people might experience less challenges in the winter. Winter, we've got darkness, we've got holidays, there's a whole bunch of things playing in. So people might be experiencing more challenges, but it is a myth that there are higher suicide rates.
So what do you think it is about the holidays that can make grief feel more compounded?
We do have an expectation, I think, generally, that holidays are a time for family, that they're a time that is supposed to be special. And if we're struggling, or we're having a hard time, or we're dealing with grief, it gets compared to that expectation of, this is supposed to be a happy time, this is supposed to be a great time, and this Christmas is awful because I don't have someone with me, or I don't have an experience that I was looking forward to or hoping. So I think that the difference between reality and expectations becomes very apparent at a time that is supposed to be special.
That's part of the way this time of the year gets described, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. And I think depending on your experience, that can be true, but oftentimes these have been difficult times for families. I think not having basic needs and resources can really impact how someone gets through this time of the year. And there's this expectation that we create this happy, merry, wonderful situation. And I'm someone who does love this time of the year, but I think that's sometimes something that comes along with the privilege of being able to do that, and not just economically or financially, but how healthy we are as individuals, our mental health and our physical health, makes a big difference in how well we're able to bring those kinds of things to other people. So if the expectation is up here to be happy, jolly, this is a wonderful time, the most wonderful time of the year, but we feel down here, we're gonna have to like fake it till we make it, right? Which can be valuable to an extent, but I think if we're not authentic about how we're really feeling, and if we don't take steps to take care of ourselves, we're gonna have a hard time meeting that expectation.
So speaking on a personal level, the holidays really compound my grief when I see others with a baby and I think this would have been my daughter's first Christmas, or this would have been the Christmas that she would be really understanding. And so I think it's the loss of either what we wanted or what we had. So for those that may have lost people that they've had beside them their whole lives, it's having to experience something without them, in which you experience something so positively with them in the past. And that's why, you know, to help me, I actually look and try to gain joy out of those people who do have their children with them. And when I think of other people that are losing things in Christmas time or holiday season, surrounding yourself with others that also loved that individual is really helpful, because then they understand that, yeah, there's a piece missing, but they're still here. You know, they're in our hearts, they're in our soul, they're in our memories, and really taking comfort in that.
Do you think someone can make the grief process worse for a friend or family member by bringing it up?
Absolutely not. They may not want to talk about it at that time, but what you've done is created an opportunity and a space where they could express those feelings and thoughts in the future if they want to.
I don't think bringing up your concern for someone you care about in and of itself can make the grieving process worse, especially if someone is taking a caring and considerate approach and is speaking out of love or speaking out of concern. I think that it's much more likely to help and help make an opportunity for someone to seek connection and get maybe additional support if they need it, as opposed to the opposite, which is, you know, pretending that nothing is happening or not reaching out for fear of making it worse.
It's certainly possible to go about trying to help someone without really having the skill or the knowledge to do so, and maybe aggravating the situation. But I think, you know, that's in the same category of myths that we carry around, that if we talk about it, it's going to make it worse, or, you know, if we talk about loss, grief, depression, or even things like suicide, that we are encouraging those things to happen. But the fact of the matter is, at least according to the most contemporary research on the subject, that's not the case. And in fact, when we don't talk about what's really going on or how we're really truly feeling, the likelihood of us getting help and to access resources or to get the connection and love or support that we need is considerably lower.
Are there any common signs or symptoms to look in for a friend or family member that you're concerned about?
The fact that you said that grief is different for everybody is really instructive there, because who's going to know somebody better than their friends or their family, than their parents or the people who are close to them? Seeing a change in someone or seeing an unexpected behavior or pattern that someone has, that's going to be a good indicator. Something is different. Something is telling me that my friend or my loved one is struggling. So they absolutely are maybe the best positioned person to reach out and help provide additional support or connection.
If you know someone has gone through a loss and you see behavior that is erratic or uncharacteristic, it's worth mentioning to them, but it can show itself in so many different ways. You know, it can look like anger or sadness or never wanting to be alone or excessive substance abuse. It can show its face in many different ways. So just knowing your friends and knowing what's outside of their norm is important.
So if someone is at home watching this and identifying with feelings of grief, what is one thing that you would recommend that they can do to tame that feeling?
So I'm not even sure who said this, but I find there to be a great deal of wisdom in it, and there actually is research to support this phenomenon. But the saying kind of goes like this: if you can name it, you can tame it. So there's a component of emotional intelligence that's really helpful, that can help us cope, that can help us to be more resilient, just by being able to, first of all, notice that something's happening emotionally within ourselves, and to try to find out what that is, to give it a name, so then we can try to work with it from there, you know. And like I had said before, I think since we don't commonly associate grieving with a lifestyle change or an occupational shift, but more so with a death, that we can miss that might be what's going on. And so all these feelings and stages that often are associated with grief and grieving and loss, we might not recognize that that's part of why, if we are having an emotionally challenging time or experiencing a lot of unpleasant feelings, that could be a part of it, and potentially a major part of it.
Being able to identify the feeling is really important. So taking that time to reflect on how that feeling is resonating in your brain and body. And then I would invite them to do a grounding exercise. It's very simple, very quick. All they need to do is sit down, and they could even close their eyes if they wanted. Just take a deep breath and identify one thing you can taste, then identify 2 things you can smell, then 3 things that you can hear, 4 things that you can feel, and then open your eyes and 5 things that you can see.
The word tame in association with grief is interesting, right? Because I wonder what our expectations are of a feeling of grief. Jay Warden had published the 4 tasks of grief, which are different than the stages of grief. And those stages are accepting the reality of the loss and dealing with the pain of loss is the first 2 tasks. So knowing that something that we need to do to successfully navigate grief is feel the feelings that it's giving us, right? That we will be sad, we will be overwhelmed, we will have days where we need to do less or that we need to stop and heal. So something that we can do is make sure that we have supports around either ourselves or the loved ones that we're concerned about, to say, hey, it is going to be okay if today you can't, quote unquote, function. If you need time to slow down, if you need time to cry, if you need time to heal, that we make sure that that's okay. That we are going to have to feel some very difficult feelings as a way of learning something about this experience and better understanding what's happening to us in our own lives now that we've lost someone that we care about.
Families are having to be creative about family gatherings for safety concerns this year. What are some of the tips you can offer to those who are having to part with their traditions this year?
That's a really good question. I would invite them to reflect on concessions that have had to be made this year, and then focus on the highlights. You know, think about some great memories that you've had, share some hopes for the future, and maybe even feel liberated or inspired to start new traditions.
Social media gets a really bad rap because of many of the challenges that we have, but it does offer an opportunity to make and maintain connections. And there still is a lot of value in reaching out and making that connection, making that extra phone call, doing an extra video conference, and maybe going outside of our comfort zone with, hey, I need to make time to connect with someone and tell them that I appreciate them, to tell them that I miss them, that I care about them. So.
When we think about traditions, that's what connects us, and that's why they're so important. They bring a nostalgia, they bring a personal story or history. And so what I'd encourage people to do this year, in a time that we might not be able to experience it like we normally do, be creative. Can you do it in a different way? So for example, I just said to my husband last night, we need to play charades on Zoom with my family, because that's what we do on Christmas Eve. We all play charades, but we're gonna have to do it on Zoom this year. Is that the best? No. But is that what's necessary? Yes. And the funny thing is, we're gonna laugh about it in like 2 years, 3 years time. We'll be able to look back and say, remember when they couldn't see this and all this, you know. So in a difficult time like we're experiencing right now, try to reframe how we look at traditions. Can we change them just ever so slightly? Can we build a deeper appreciation for the traditions and acknowledge that while we might not to do it this year, next year it'll be that much more special. And so sometimes just the way in which we think about what's going on this year can help.
What would you say to someone who is struggling with grief during the holiday season?
You know, that's a funny question. I think the short answer is I would just say I love you. And I think it's a tough thing, you know, thinking about what you might say that could be helpful with someone. Like, sure, we can give information, you know, we can do teaching around emotional intelligence, we can do teaching about, you know, what grief is, what it means, and how to cope with it. But I find that sometimes in my own experience and what I've observed in others is that it's not so much what we say to other people in times of grief and loss, but just being there, like our physical presence with other people that are suffering, who are hurting, who might be grieving or have experienced loss or who have just an abundance of stress in their life, listening and being there, because oftentimes I think there aren't any words. There aren't any prescriptive, you know, statements that we can give that fixes anything. I think just knowing that we're not alone, I think knowing that we're heard and knowing that we're loved and cared about can do a lot.
I would say to them that they're not alone and encourage them to reach out to their support system. If they don't have any person that they would feel comfortable reaching out to, we have a great crisis line in town called Ketchikan Cares. We also have a wealth of mental health professionals as well.
I would want, whether it was someone I cared about personally or someone who's a member of my community, I would want them to know that we care about them and that their feelings are real and important. And I would ask if they have the support around them to navigate those very difficult and very painful feelings. But I would definitely want to emphasize that those feelings are part of the healing process, and that we want to help support them as they navigate through them.
To all of those people that are struggling with grief, you're not alone, and it's okay. You know, don't shy away from it, experience it, reach out when you need to reach out. It's a difficult time, but you'll get through it, and people will be there to support you through it, so yeah.
What are some local resources that you can recommend to offer to those who are grieving?
Okay, so we do have some resources that the school district is helping to support. I believe that those have been made available as far as some of the flyers, but the Ketchikan's Care Line is an excellent resource that we have in the community that people can reach out to 24/7 to seek support if there's a crisis. Or they're concerned and not sure what next steps are going to be. We do have a variety of mental health supports in the community that may be available. It is a challenge to connect to those resources right now because the demand is really high. But the Ketchikan Care Line can help navigate that process and help people connect to someone who can provide an appropriate support.
So until December 31st, there is a grief support group happening in the plaza. There's also the Ketchikan Cares line, and then to find numbers and contact information for other mental health professionals, there's the Ketchikan 123 website.
So Ketchikan, we've actually got quite a few resources available to people grieving in our community. I would encourage everybody to pick up a community guidebook. It's a resource guide and it lists all of our mental health providers, but it also lists support groups. And we do actually have some support groups in the community, and I'd just like to tell you a little bit about them. We have the bereavement support group, which is hosted at Peace Health. and it is a volunteer group of people that help individuals through loss. We also have the Compassionate Friends group, and they don't meet regularly, but if somebody's lost a child, that is a great group to connect with. And there's a local kind of chapter. Bet Jacobet actually is the one who facilitates that, and she's so wonderful that she herself is a great resource. But there's also a state and a national alliance of compassionate friends. We also have, there's also available online groups. If you want to be anonymous, there's Facebook groups that are dedicated to grief. And we may not think like we want to go online, but sometimes that separation can also be helpful for some people. We also have right now RYC, Ketchikan Wellness Coalition, and WISH are partnering together to offer grief support sessions from 3 to 5 on Tuesdays and Thursdays through the end of this year. And that's open to adults and youth available. So that's at KWC's location number 203 at the Plaza. I also know that there are some faith groups that offer grief support circles at different times of the year. They've done like workshops where it's a 6-week series in which groups of individuals gather and share their experiences, and they actually have like a curriculum to follow. And I've heard really positive things about that. I don't know exactly when they're offered, but I would really encourage anybody who is engaged in a faith group at church, or speak to your pastor, and they will know some great resources. You can also probably be connected individually to somebody else who might be experiencing the same thing or has gone through it. So the resource guide is available throughout the community, at community organizations, at the hospital, at the Ketchikan Wellness Coalition building in the plaza. We also have a copy online. It's a PDF version on our website that you could access as well. Most doctors and clinics have copies of these, or you can always call us and we're happy to meet up with you to provide you with one.